Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Trump's tariffs are here, and it's really important to understand, well, what's the damage? And I must say, I apologize for the late video for today. Yeah, another bad weekend for me. I was in the cardiac unit in Nelson Mandela Bay. Unfortunately, I had an irregular heartbeat. And so to that, I would say, Dr. Hendricks, I know you said you watched the show. Thanks so much for getting my heart rate back to a proper heart rate. And to the nurse, Monica Buthelezi, thanks for looking after me. Really do appreciate it. Anyway, let's get on to the video of today. The first is that, as you'll know, Trump announced his 30% import tariffs on 70 plus countries, including South Africa. So it's important to remember we're not the only ones. Now, you will remember that the tariffs are framed as being part of a reciprocal trade agenda, with Canada punished the worst for its suggestion that it would recognize Palestine. Now, South Africa is amongst one of the hardest hit, with tariffs tripling from 10% to 30% almost overnight. And as I've already discussed, the key sectors affected were automobiles, metals, wines, poultry, pork, and macadamians. Only some precious metals and processed agri exports were spared the blow. So let's actually have a look at what's already happened. I mean, it's important to understand that the actual tariffs are only due to actually come in like the 7th of August. There was this short reprieve. It was like a 7-day notice. And in typical fashion, the South African government tends to think that this is somehow a way for them to continue negotiating. Anyway, that's not actually the purpose of the 7 days. The 7 days are meant to allow all the individuals to put their admin in place to be able to process the tariffs. So what has happened so far? Remembering that the tariffs haven't even kicked in, and we're already starting to see the effects of what the full tariffs, once they're actually in, are going to mean to South African goods. So the South African auto exports to the US nosedived 72% in June. Mercedes-Benz reports 100 million plus in losses. Steel and aluminium were already hit with 50% tariffs, and they've now been slammed again with the 30% tariff. So one Eastern Cape company lost 750 million rand overnight just on an order. There are currently only 2 companies doing direct shipping routes to the US, and one of them have pulled out overnight, which means that logistics costs are set to spike, and exporters are no doubt going to have a very tough time because the number of exporters went from 2 to 1. When it comes to wine producers, they've already warned that South African wine could be globally uncompetitive, and the industry itself, which supports 270,000 jobs, is likely to have, well, you can guess it, job cuts. In terms of macadamias, it looks like the US is moving to Australia to buy their macadamia nuts from Australia rather than South Africa. In terms of the poultry and the pork industries, we're now looking at some huge US concessions around food safety, which will end up being non-negotiable, which also means that the export of pork probably going to be uncompetitive. The only agricultural industry that tended to buck the trend was processed vegetable and canned goods, of which US imports have increased. So as you can see, the actual economic impact so far has actually been really bad, with news coming out that half of South African small businesses fear collapse within the next year. Unfortunately, according to Darby Roots, the tariffs are going to be what he describes as the nail in the coffin for GDP, which means that growth in South Africa could be cut by 2%. Now remember that growth at the moment is like 0.7%. So we're effectively going to be in a formal recession. And the net result of that is probably going to mean that the rand weakens against the dollar, meaning we're going to have inflation when it comes through to the cost of goods, and investor sentiment in the country is likely to be shaken. So what's Ramaphosa doing? Well, Ramaphosa says we've got to engage the Americans, not confront them, but engage them. And this was after the suggestion came out that the deal fell apart because there was a suggestion of a US military base in South Africa. Now, Ramaphosa has gone directly against this and said this was never one of the negotiation points, so he doesn't really know where it came from. So the government has instead offered 59 billion rand in US investments, and has offered to export gas to the US in order to avoid tariffs. But as you know, there's been no real success on this deal. The ANC NEC over the weekend backed the Minister of Trade, Parks, to lead the diplomacy efforts. And so it looks like they are going to be bypassing Durka now, and Parks is going to negotiate everything himself. Now, Cabinet is fast-tracking what they're describing as an export support desk and release measures to protect jobs in the industries in the intervening period. But there's been no details surrounding this, so what's going to happen? Well, no one knows. Now, for those of you who don't know, Lesotho had textile exports which were originally hit with a 50% tariff. And Lesotho, which was worried about factory job losses, actually negotiated a deal with the US, which meant that their tariffs were lowered to 15%. Because ultimately, they were worried that the US market would become unreachable. So the question really remains, is South Africa going to be able to do the same? Now, one of the suggestions that have come out from the ANC is that they've suggested the South African market should pivot to African trade instead of US trade. In other words, they're looking for new people who could buy their goods. But in the news that came out over the weekend, they've looked at African markets, and the African markets are described as being too small, unstable, and overregulated, which means that it would be impossible for them to absorb South African exports. Now, according to the Western Cape's Premier, Alan Winde, he says farmers have no viable local alternatives. The only alternative for their goods is the US. So the African Free Trade Zone is not yet ready to offset a US market. And no one is. So the reality is that the Ramaphosa regime needs to get their finger out and sort something out with the US, because there are no alternative markets. It's the US or nothing. So for all of those haters that is like, you keep your America, who needs America? We'll just pivot to China, whoever else. News out is that there's no one else to pivot to. It's America or nothing. So that's the news. Anyway, just my opinions. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.